it really excites me that we can bring him back here. So help me in welcoming back to SIU Dean Kessman.
I'm going to go rather quickly. I tend to talk a lot in the beginning and start having to rush at the end of the talk, but we will get there eventually. But since I went to school here, I thought I would start out with a few images that were in my portfolio when I applied to the program. And this work was done back in around 1991, 92, 90, so almost 15, 16 years ago now. And the reason I came back to graduate school was I realized I knew very little about the history of photography, or really what it meant to be an artist. I started working seriously and making photographs over a number of years, but I was finding my inspiration from a very small group of people. I was looking at, Paul Strand and Edward Weston, and about as contemporary as I got was Aaron Siskin and possibly Minor White, and this was 1990. A lot had happened since those photographers had been working. So I came back to school, and one of the first bodies of work that I made in school is starting with this image, and visually there was not much difference in what I was doing. I was still working with traditional materials, large format camera, shooting black and white film, making silver prints. With the older work, I was actually making contact prints. I wasn't even enlarging the negatives, so a very sort of purist approach. And with this image, I made the radical move to like 6 by 8 inch images. I was slightly enlarging them. Whoops, sorry, went backwards. And even though in the beginning these images were very much like what I was doing visually in that earlier work, they started to shift in a subtle way because I was trying to bring some content into the work. And that happened very simply in this series by the subject matter that I chose. And I decided that I wanted to look at the landscape that existed along this interstate highway that I drove on every day to and from work. And there were areas along this landscape that was sort of changing and continually changing. And I started to stop at these places where they were adding exit ramps or extending that highway and look at that particular landscape that was changing. And like I said, it wasn't, I think about it now, it wasn't like any kind of radical change, but there was this level of content that I was bringing into the work and trying to speak to this idea of the construction of the landscape, or of the highway versus the destruction of the landscape, and that when these roadways are put in, they don't just change that tiny strip of land, they kind of change the surrounding land. And this is something that I even came back to later. You'll see in a much later series, I refocused on this landscape once again. I also started looking at a lot more work, and for this series, Robert Adams became very important in his approach to photography and resisting that urge to romanticize the landscape and instead look at how our presence on it is really changing it. And probably this, I think, was in my second year of graduate school. I was commuting a lot of the time from St. Louis, and so I drove a 2-hour drive once to twice to 3 times a week, going back and forth. And I was introduced to some photographers in a show called, I think it was Typology's 9 Contemporary Photographers, and it had people like Thomas Roof and Thomas Struth and Candida Hofer, I believe, and the Beckers, Hilla and Bernd Becker. And a lot of those people on that show were actually their students from the Dusseldorf Academy in Germany. And that work really changed the way that I thought about photography, because in some ways it fit very firmly in this traditional documentary approach, but they were embraced more, and I'm speaking about the Beckers especially, embraced more by contemporary artists, in the fact that they were using the medium of photography in order to create this large archive of remnants of the Industrial Revolution, because they were shooting things like water towers and blast furnaces and factory buildings, and just building this massive archive of these places. And what I chose were the statues of the Virgin Mary. And it wasn't just a random choice for me. I had been raised Catholic, so I had that very personal connection. But before I entered graduate school, while I was in graduate school, and for a few years after I graduated, I worked as a staff photographer for an order of Catholic priests that were located in Belleville, Illinois, called the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. And in addition to doing missionary work around the world, they ran this shrine of Our Lady of the Snows, which is like the largest, shrine to the Virgin Mary in North America, I believe, and it's in Belleville, Illinois, a couple hours from here. So I had this personal and kind of professional connection to the Virgin Mary, and so I started noticing these statues as I was driving to school. And it's kind of like when you buy a new car, and then all of a sudden you see that car everywhere. When I started noticing these statues, it was just sort of, they were everywhere, and I would catch a glimpse of one in somebody's backyard and would just pull over, and I just kind of extended my commute, gave myself 4 hours to get to school instead of 2, so that I could, photograph along the way. And I was just really intrigued by the ways that people displayed these statues and where they placed them, and tried to figure out, what it meant to them, not by talking to them personally, but by the way I found these statues. And some were very meticulously kept up, others were in kind of these overgrown yards. One like this that's flanked by these pink flamingos. I couldn't have set up something as good as this, so it was fun to just happen upon them. The final image in this series, I took a little bit different perspective and moved kind of behind the statue and kind of looked at what that statue was watching over. And in a funny way, that statue really took on a different presence for me by standing behind it. It almost seemed like it might be a person standing there and not a piece of concrete watching over this yard, and actually watching over that dog, which is another yard ornament. It's a porcelain dog that's sitting out in that yard. Whoops. I didn't know it at the time, but that ended up being kind of the beginning of my thesis exhibition here at SIU, and that show was called Questions of Faith. And so all of the work, in one way or another, was questioning my faith, which was Catholicism. And I decided to not show the entire series, but instead just choose 3 images that I felt kind of represented that work pretty well, and then printed them very large. They were 40 or 50 by 50 inch prints. And then I also, for the first time, brought in this sculptural component into my work, where I had the 3 photographs facing these unfinished concrete statues of the Virgin Mary that I got from a lawn ornament kind of supply house about halfway between here and St. Louis. And it's hard to see in this slide, but they were actually placed on this wooden pallet, something that you would see in a factory building to kind of move merchandise around, or like a Home Depot kind of a place. And that was very important to the piece, because I wanted people to kind of make this connection to these as mass-produced objects and start to look at that commodification of religion through this work and create this dialogue between these statues that had been painted and finished and cared for in different ways, and ones that were just these objects like any other sort of concrete lawn ornament, which sort of leads very well into this next series in this body of work, which I think I referred to as plastic idols. This is the kind of thing that day in, day out, I did at my job, working for those priests. I made images of rosaries and candles and statues and necklaces with crosses on it. And these images were put into direct mail campaigns. And so someone would donate, say, $25 for one of these, and the profits went to support their missionary work and, I guess, to pay my salary and everyone else who worked in this office. And I remember one object that I had to photograph, and that just really upset one of the priests in this office, and it was a little statue of the baby Jesus with Santa Claus kneeling down next to it. And he hated that piece and couldn't believe that the priest in charge was allowing us to use that in order to raise money. He didn't think it was appropriate to kind of bring those two together. And that made me start thinking a little bit more critically about some of the objects I was photographing, but also when I would take a trip for my job, we would generally be somewhere near a Catholic gift shop. And so I started nosing around and picking up items on these trips. And I amassed, maybe 20 or 30 of these, and I photographed them in this very similar way that went from ones that people kind of wouldn't think twice about, and that if they were Catholic, they might have in their home, to ones that were a bit more ridiculous and maybe even kind of insulting to some people. And this was one that I kind of found funny of, Jesus Christ sort of reaching over and helping this little boy hit that home run. And one of my all-time favorites is this Virgin Mary air freshener. I just wondered, what kind of putrid smell had to be in the air to make you reach for this one. The next series, and this is all from my thesis exhibition, so it was like these little mini shows, these little different bodies of work. This was called Rorschach Bible Pages, where I found this very old, beautiful sort of aged Bible and took pages out of it and did this Rorschach ink blot onto the pages. And then I took those pages, well, initially, actually, I should tell you, I initially had thought about displaying those pages as the work, but in the end decided that that would be a little bit too aggressive of an act, and that it would sort of lead to one conclusion, which was this desecration of this text, of this holy text, and that's not the only reading that I wanted of this work. So I decided against that, and I placed the pages onto a photographic light table and photographed them with the light coming through the pages in it. You can sort of see it in the reproduction, but what happens is the text from both sides of the page comes through, and that kind of eliminated the text where you couldn't read it. You could tell that it was a Bible, and the title told you it was a Bible, but I wasn't trying to point to any specific portion of this text. I wanted it to be more about this text in general, and so that was a way of doing it. And I also had photographed it with positive film, so the 4x5 transparency, and then negative film. And I initially did that because I wasn't sure whether I was going to make a Cibachrome print from the positive or a chromogenic print from the negative. But as I laid those pieces of film on a light table, something else happened. And I realized that instead of using one or the other to make one single print, that they kind of worked as this diptych. And it not only kind of referenced photography and having, the positive and the negative, but it also, I thought, opened it up for more interpretation, so that positive and negative could be sort of good and evil interpretations, or good and evil sort of uses and readings of the same text. And also the right side of these with the negative, it became, on the right side you had that ink blot and it sort of read as a stain. The right side became more ephemeral, I thought, with the way that dark area became white. And it also looks like an X-ray to me in some ways. And it sort of brought in this more kind of scientific, analytical inspection of this text that I use and I've used since in a lot of other work. So, but in this one in particular, it was this sort of intersection of art, religion, and science. I've got two more pieces from the thesis exhibition that I'm going to quickly go through, and these were the two most kind of personal pieces for me. And they were in the same gallery space on facing walls. And the first piece was called My Daughter's Baptism. And it had three different components. It had this baptismal gown as another way of kind of referencing the physical body of my daughter. At the top, that's a speaker, and that played this maybe a 2 or 3 minute recording of my voice talking about trying to get my daughter baptized, because when we asked this priest in our local parish to baptize our daughter, he initially refused. And he felt that she would not be brought up in a strong Catholic home, and we had been married in the Lutheran church and not the Catholic church initially, and so we had to work very hard for him to finally come around and baptize her. And then there were these series of pictures in the middle. So my voice was telling the story. Whoops, keep going backwards. My voice was telling the story, and then from left to right, this is actually my newborn picture. And I used my picture instead of my daughter's for this because I felt like he wasn't really thinking about her. He was judging her and making decisions based on my actions, not on hers. And so that's why I used my picture. And you can see there's one ripple on this print, so I wanted that sort of that ripple of water, again, to reference the baptism. And as you move from left to right, more ripples covered the picture until that picture was sort of dissolved, and that identity of that baby, both in the image and in that little blocks of text at the top of it, became obliterated and erased. And then about 7 or 8 months before I graduated, before I had this show, when I was well into producing the work, my father unexpectedly died. He had been diagnosed with a brain tumor and within a matter of months passed away. And so this work was a way of kind of working through that situation. And unfortunately, again, there was a situation where this was a different priest that I had asked to say some words at his service, had a very different idea of what we should do for his funeral. And myself and my family had decided something different, and he essentially was telling us we were wrong and that my father would have wanted something else. And so in this piece, I talked about that experience, and instead of using an audio component again, because I didn't want those two pieces to be competing with each other, I laid the text on top of a picture of my father from his wedding. And so I'll just show you, I've got 3 of these images. I'll put them up for a minute so you get a sense of the tone of the text. It's kind of a back and forth between my voice and the priest's voice, but I won't show all of them, but you can get a sense of what I was doing. And I had had enough at that point. I was exhausted. And those of you who are in graduate school now and are working towards your thesis, you should be when you have that show. If you're not working hard enough. But it was also emotionally draining in that some of these pieces were very personal. And at that point, when I moved on, graduated, and started working again, I decided to really return back to work like I was doing before I entered graduate school, where it was much more visual again and not nearly as personal. And a very good friend of mine who's also a photographer, Richard Springler in St. Louis, had been hired by the owners of this group of about 5 warehouse buildings that were historic buildings in downtown St. Louis. And he was doing this very traditional documentary project for this company. And he invited me to come along at some point. And instead of kind of repeating what he was doing, I thought that I would do a little bit more sort of personal, a little bit more poetic sort of work about this space. And this series was called Abandoned Spaces. And one thing that really struck me about these buildings when I went inside were the floors of them. I kept sort of looking down, and I felt like that really told me a lot about the space and about what happens when a place is sort of left and is overtaken by, pigeons and rodents. And so some of the pictures I felt could be very beautiful, while others, like this one, were very kind of not so beautiful. This pile of pigeon droppings that always reminds me of the fact that I've probably taken a couple years off my life going into these warehouse buildings repeatedly and breathing the air in these closed spaces. This image for me too, I really spoke to me about that place because it seemed very violent to me. It seemed almost like a blood stain on the floor, or even like a bruised body in some ways, that I thought was kind of a good metaphor for this place and what happens when something is not taken care of. And then there were other images like this that were a bit more serene, I guess, more contemplative, that could look like it might be, a starry night, but as you approach the print, you would notice, and you can't really notice in this reproduction, but those larger white spots are actually pigeon feathers that were floating in just this very shallow pool of water. On one of the days, probably after I had been photographing in the buildings for a while, we went into a new building and walked into one of these warehouse floors where it's almost wide open. It's maybe half the building, this just wide open space. And as we came out of the stairwell and walked in, I had been just sort of stopped in my tracks. And this room was infused with this beautiful, warm, glowing light. And as I looked around, each of those large, kind of massive warehouse windows looked like this. And I learned that, these windows had been painted in order to protect merchandise from sun damage. And so over the years, by having them been painted and weathered and painted and weathered, that this is kind of the result of that. And so there were, I don't know how many windows, maybe 10, 15 of these in that space. And it almost seemed like a holy space in kind of an odd way, because I just kept thinking about these as, stained glass windows in a church. But instead of having representational kind of imagery on it, instead they were these grids of abstract paintings. And so I just did very straightforward photographs of these. And then when I presented them, I made fairly large prints. They were maybe 30 by 40, nowhere near the size of the windows. But they were printed onto a Duratrans material and put in light boxes so that the viewer's experience of this work would be somewhat like my experience of the windows, where the light's emanating from these windows and not reflecting off of like the way that you view a photograph. And then here are just a couple details of 2 of those panes. And after this work, I think I did a couple of series of landscape images that I've not put into this lecture tonight. And these were done around 1997, 98, so a year or two after I graduated. And there was also an audio component to this work as well that I didn't bring a sample of, that started out being me just recording the ambient noise of this building and wanted to have that in a gallery, but it really sort of developed into much more than that, and I brought in some friends of mine who were percussionists and musicians, and we really started using the building like an instrument. And so I might be running around squeaking a window or dragging or kicking glass, and another person would be playing drums on a big barrel that was overturned, and somebody else might be mimicking us with a guitar or a violin. And so we ended up with about a 60-minute CD of maybe 10 distinct compositions that were put onto it that were sort of this industrial ambient noise type of music. So in 1999, I created a series that was entitled Transubstantiation, Wafers and Wine, Body and Blood. And so this is kind of a return back to some of that religious work that I was doing in grad school. And I'd actually begun to work with wafers in grad school, but the work never resolved itself. I never quite figured out what to do with those materials. And so it was just something, an idea that I guess just sort of sat in the back of my head for a number of years. And then at some point I had the idea of making a photogram of a wafer saturated in wine. So I would take, I've got an image here where I would take a wafer that was unconsecrated, obviously. I bought it right off the shelf at a Catholic supply store, and you can get them, the very small ones that most people are used to seeing in a Catholic Mass, to the very large ones that the priest generally has. And I would just put it on a plate, pour wine, red wine on it, let it absorb it, and then slide those onto a larger piece of paper, manipulate it a little bit with my hands to change the consistency of it, and then shine light on it. And what I was thinking a lot about when doing this was the Shroud of Turin, and this idea that, you know, the image of Christ was transferred directly from his body to this piece of cloth. And so I was using the wafer and wine that during the celebration of Eucharist in a Catholic Mass we're supposed to believe literally become the body and blood of Christ. And so it was very important that I was taking these substances, putting them directly onto this photographic paper, and then when I processed the print, it kind of left this trace. So in some ways they were like portraits to me. And as I started building up this series of images, and I made, you know, maybe 30 or 40 of these and started to show them to people, the one reaction that I was consistently getting was that they looked very lunar or very planetary. And that wasn't what I had initially thought was going to happen with these images. But as I heard more and more people say that, I agreed with that reading. And when I presented the work, I decided to, you know, put them in these circular frames. They've got this bubble glass over the frames to kind of reinforce the idea of this kind of spherical nature of a planet, or this heavenly body floating in space, and then presented them in this sort of constellation that was, you know, somewhat random, but also had some kind of order to it as well. And that, at this point, you know, as I was making this work, I thought this was the end of it. I thought this was going to be the body of work. But as often happens as you're making work, one thing leads to the next. And one night while I was printing these photograms, and they're all unique. You can only get one photogram with each wafer because it just becomes this mush. And when you slide it off, you can't get it back onto another piece of paper. So I would just sort of squeegee it off into a tray. and then I would go on and do another one. So I would make a lot of these in one printing session. And I remember one night when I turned on the light in the darkroom after I'd made a lot of prints, I looked at this tray, and I just had this real visceral response to these materials that I'd never had before, where, you know, it just looked like a mass of bloody flesh. And again, I had grown up Catholic, I had taken communion most of my life, and I knew as a Catholic I was supposed to believe that in taking communion that I was sort of taking the body and the blood of Christ into my body, but it sort of never was like that for me. It was always, I was eating bread and I was drinking wine. And this sort of changed that, and all of a sudden began to think about this as what it is, this sort of body and blood ritual. And this sort of opened it up to other interpretations and other ways of thinking about this either a cannibalistic sort of act, or even having kind of sexual connotations and bringing someone else's body or blood into your mouth, into your body. And so I took about maybe 150 of these larger, like 9-inch in diameter wafers, and would just saturate one and put it onto this flat surface, and then put another one, and built it up until it looked like this. And this is just then a straight photograph looking down on a table of, you know, somewhere around 100 of these wafers. And then it was presented as an altar. It's actually a 4 by 6 foot light box, and so again, that's a transparency, and then kind of draped like an altar. It's sort of this location where this transubstantiation takes place in a church. And and then here's a detail. Yeah, that was my response. So when I initially did those photograms, you know, what I thought they would look like, and I think they did in some ways, is I was thinking that they would look like magnifications of cells. And like I said, I think they did to some degree, but that other interpretation seemed to make more sense, but I still wanted that to happen in the work. So the next series that I did to kind of complete this body of work was to take these wafers, again saturated in wine, but now I put them onto a flatbed scanner that had a transparency adapter. So instead of making a photogram, I was making a scanogram, essentially, and having the light go through it as if I was scanning a piece of film. And then I scanned all the wafers individually, and then I brought them into a digital file, and I had been sort of doing a little bit of research and looking at medical textbooks, and I came across some images of blood cells. And so that's kind of what I was referring to with these images. You know, they obviously don't look exactly like that, but anybody who has seen those types of images would make that connection. And so this work sort of moved from this cellular kind of microscopic reading of these materials again, that's become the body and blood of Christ, to the celestial reading of them with the photograms, and then kind of back again as you leave the exhibition space. At this time, this exhibition was in 2002. And there's a curator in St. Louis, and he's the director of Gallery 210 at University of Missouri, St. Louis, and his name's Terry Surrey. And he saw this body of work and then contacted me and was planning an exhibition for the following year, and was interested in what I was doing, you know, what I was working on, because he wanted to work with me. And this was going to be a group exhibition. So I met with him a number of times, and I told him, and this was sort of just a vague idea at the time. I didn't know what was going to happen with it. But I thought, I'd been thinking about this idea of X-raying a building, and in particular, a gallery space. And and so, you know, it was very vague, and so I talked to him a little bit about it, and he liked how it sounded, and so he started looking for other artists that could do some site-specific kind of work that were also dealing with architectural space. So he put together this 4-person exhibition, and the piece on the ceiling, the hanging piece, is Jill Downen. She teaches at Washington University now. And then there was Mel Watkin, who is also a local artist, actually. Her husband teaches here in the art department. And she did these wall drawings, and you can kind of see one in the middle of the slide in the back room, and they were kind of this fantastic fungi, sort of, that in different areas directly onto the gallery wall, she made these drawings. And then another artist who I don't have pictured here, Sue Sunny Park, did this inflatable sculpture that was kind of connected into the ventilation system of the gallery. So while the gallery is open, this would sort of breathe like a lung, so it would fill up and then it would deflate. And then I did these x-rays that were presented in these light boxes of the gallery walls and the floor. And as the project evolved, you know, as I was thinking about this work, I was thinking a lot about how I was using this process that artists generally don't use. You think of x-rays as something that happens in a hospital to kind of look at something that you can't see with your eyes. And I wanted to apply it to this gallery space. And again, kind of in thinking about a space that we move within, that our bodies move through kind of as a body, in a way of exposing this architectural space's internal organs and revealing something that we can't see with our eyes, but also revealing something about the history of that space, in that other artists who have hung work in this gallery have left marks. There may be nails in the wall that were covered up, or other types of things that were inserted into the wall that were left there, and by x-raying it, I would kind of expose that and reveal some of that history. But I wasn't content to just sort of reveal its history. In the end, I decided that I wanted to intervene into the space as well. And so for this particular area, what I did was I drilled a hole in the wall, and then I took wiring, electrical wiring, that would be a material you would find in between a wall, and I just filled it with as much as I could. So I maybe got, you know, 150, 200 feet of wire, until it just sort of, I couldn't push any more in. And then I just tucked it in, sealed the wall off, and then did an x-ray of that area. And that was a pretty drastic change in my thinking about this work, because not only this two-dimensional work of art, this kind of piece of x-ray film, the piece was sort of that and what existed inside the wall. And when this exhibition was taken down, you know, those remnants still remained. So some of that work that I created existed in that wall for somebody to discover later. And then here's another installation shot with 2 of the light boxes. This one too. On this wall, I actually had access to the back side of it. So it was sealed off in the front, but the back side of the wall wasn't closed. So I saw this box that had wiring coming into it, and I created this kind of nonsensical loop that came out of that box, but then went back in. And, you know, it's ridiculous to do something like that. You know, why do you come out to then just go right back in the same place? And I wanted to do these kinds of things because I wanted people to start to question whether what they were looking at was actually there or not. And I had been teaching some digital photography at that time, and I remember some of my students coming up and saying, "Oh, that's, you know, kind of funny how you manipulated that in Photoshop." And you know, I was able to tell them that no, it wasn't in Photoshop I was doing it, but there was manipulation involved, but I was manipulating the actual space before I made that image. And then there were other places where I didn't do that at all, like this one of the floor. was just a straight X-ray of that particular area. And also something that's important is these X-rays were hung directly over the space where they were taken. So as you stood and looked at one of these X-rays, you saw what, again, is not visible with the naked eye. And there's another thing that I remember at the time that was kind of exciting for me about this work, was that I lost some control. For the most part, my work is very precise, and I'm kind of a control freak, and I want to have total control over what happens. And with this series, I didn't. I didn't know what existed in between some of these walls. I might be able to guess where there was a stud, or I might be able to choose to do it where there was an outlet, but I didn't know exactly what I was going to find. So that was something that I liked, that I hadn't done in the past. And I did that at 2 different locations in St. Louis, and then when I moved out to Washington, D.C., I was selected to do a show in the project room at a place in Baltimore called School 33. And so this was a relatively small room, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet. And I did the X-rays again, but I wanted to kind of expand upon this project. It seemed to be getting just a little repetitive and not that interesting to just repeat that. And so I dropped microphones into each of the 4 walls, and then had those brought into a mixing board and into an amplifier, and had a set of headphones with a wire long enough that people could sort of move throughout that entire space. And as you wore those, you could hear sort of your movements around the space, kind of this muffled sound. But also if you would touch the walls, rub your hands on the walls, you could hear that. It was amplified. And so it really changed the way that people interacted with this architectural space. And then that show was around 2002, and I was working on it also in St. Louis around 2001. And I think right after that, I started this next series, which is called Plant Detritus. And I started noticing in my neighborhood all of these little piles of leaves and branches and pollen and pine needles and pine cones that just sort of formed by wind patterns in certain areas. And I saw them on my driveway, and I just kept looking at them for a while, and then I started making Polaroid pictures of them because there was something there. I didn't know what it was or what I wanted to do with this work, but I was drawn to these little piles. And at some point in this process, I decided that I would make this Polaroid picture of the way I found it, and then I just swept all this stuff up and put it into a Ziploc bag and dropped in that Polaroid picture with it, and brought all of that back to my studio, and then dumped it out onto this white surface and sat down with that Polaroid and pieced it back together like it was a puzzle. And so I tried to get it as close to the way I found it as possible, to the point where I was on the floor with tweezers moving little pieces of hay and branches. And then I rephotographed that and had iris prints made on kind of a nice fine art paper. It was before the Epson printers were as good as they are now. And so I had a company in St. Louis who was making iris prints produce these for me. And then when I exhibited this work, it was in a group show called Regarding Nature, I decided to remake the piles again on the gallery floor. So I had the Polaroids on one wall that had these piles kind of in their original context where I found them, the photographs of the piles that I reproduced in my studio and rephotographed, and then the actual material on the gallery floor so that people could move around the actual objects. And, you know, I was thinking a lot about, you know, photography, and through photographs we reproduce things. And I was interested in this project to not only rephotograph something in order to make a reproduction, but to kind of physically work with the materials and reproduce it that way, and then rephotograph it, and then kind of reproduce it once again for the exhibition on the gallery floor. So that was, I think, somewhere around 2002, I think I said. I almost pulled this body of work out of this talk, because initially I couldn't think of how it connected to what I was doing, because I sort of jumped back and forth between different projects. And, you know, a lot of times I don't see the connections until much later, when I can look at it in a context of more work. And this one I was sort of struggling with. I couldn't think, oh, how does this fit? Why did I sort of go from what I was just doing with these little piles of plant detritus to this work? And then all of a sudden it hit me, and it became very obvious. What this work is, it's much more of kind of a traditional approach to the landscape, but it's actually right off of the interstate highways again. So I talked about that earlier, that I returned to this landscape later. And so this was 2001, 2002, and I had been looking at these grasses for years, and just right off the side of the interstates and kind of in between the exit ramps. And in the fall and winter especially, in this time of year, I just found that these grasses were just like really beautiful, and I just, you know, sort of enjoyed them at 65 miles an hour for years, and finally pulled over to make images of them. And there were places where there were these signs that you would see at like a botanical gardens, where it would tell what kind of plant this was. And so I called the Illinois Department of Transportation and asked them why they were there. And the person told me that they had received funding, a grant a number of years back, to reintroduce native grasses into these areas of the state-owned property along the interstate. So I thought that was kind of interesting how, you know, these interstates came through and wiped out a lot of this stuff, and then they were reintroducing those plants that were native to this area back in these little areas. And that connection that I saw between that earlier work and this one was that those earlier piles were kind of surrounded by this concrete or this asphalt they were sitting in, and this was the same thing. It was this little patch of nature that was actually surrounded by a highway. So it might look as if this is kind of an expansive space in a large prairie, but, you know, there's cars flying by me at 65 miles an hour, like, you know, 10 or 15 feet behind where I'm taking this picture. And so that, for me, kind of started to make sense in how I went from one to the next. And so I did this for a while, and initially I was wanting to just keep it to those grasses. I thought I would just eliminate the highway from the pictures and just focus on these little patches of native grasses. But I got, I guess, bored with doing that, and slowly started to kind of bring that landscape that existed beyond this strip of land into the pictures. And it became more about looking at that landscape that exists off of this interstate again. I did sort of keep that focus where all of these images were made right off the landscape or right off the interstate, and wanted to look at how this landscape had changed over the years because of this road, or these roads. These were all made in about, I would say, about a 40-mile radius of St. Louis. Some of these places were the same roads that I was photographing back in about 1993, so this is almost 10 years later. But I was on a number of different interstates as well. Like this is Interstate, I think, 55 heading toward Chicago. And, another reason that I guess this is a project that I was interested in doing is that when I lived here in the Midwest, I traveled these roads every day. I mean, when you live here, you live in a car a lot of the time. When you go somewhere, you get in the car to go somewhere. And so this was a landscape that I felt really intimately familiar with, and a landscape that I really loved and that I'm still very attracted to. And so it was, very natural to begin to make pictures in this space. When I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2002, we got rid of one of our cars, and all of a sudden I wasn't driving. I'm in a city that has good public transportation, and I found myself, riding the metro underground every day to work. And so I sort of lost that pleasure of kind of looking out the window at a landscape. And to occupy my time, I just started, bringing magazines with me. And, I don't read novels. I read very little fiction, but I almost always have art magazines with me. And so it was a time to do some reading, and sort of out of nervousness, like whenever I'm given a piece of paper, within minutes, it's like this. And so as I carried those magazines onto the metro, I started looking at what happened when I rolled up the magazines and the way that the pages started to separate, and how you were kind of presented with this kind of abstract band of color and just little bits of information from the edges of each page. And this is the series of work that Jan mentioned that's in the gallery in the Department of Cinema and Photography. And this series is called Cover to Cover. And this was the first body of work that I produced when I was in Washington, D.C. And I think, when was it? I think it was 2004 when I showed the completed series. And this was sort of like those little piles that I was attracted to. I looked at these edges of these pages probably for a year thinking, there's something here that I need to work with. There's something here that I need to do, but couldn't figure out what it was. And when I look back now, it was so simple. I think I was looking for a larger transformation to take place when, in fact, all I needed to do was to roll up that magazine and then clamp it and put it on a flatbed scanner and do a high-resolution scan. And then I was able to take that and enlarge it. So I made these prints that were 2 foot long, 4 foot long, and 6 foot long. And so this was kind of the final result. And taking, I was thinking a lot about, these magazines as carriers of information and being filled with sort of mediated messages. And I like this idea of sort of further mediating it through this process of just showing bits of information from, every page, or essentially every page from cover to cover. I was also thinking a lot about people who were doing appropriation, and someone like Sherry Levine, or especially Richard Prince and his appropriation of popular culture and magazine ads or billboards. And this was not kind of working in the same way, but I was taking something, I was taking reproductions of art a lot of times, or design. Somebody designed this magazine so that when you move through it, there's a certain aesthetic that's created, but I found, a different aesthetic by rolling up the magazine and creating something that they would not have, thought of designing the magazine for. And then this is how it's presented. And it's presented this way at the gallery across the way as well. I wanted this sort of sense of information sort of moving around that space and somebody kind of being surrounded by this kind of digital information, this sort of movement of information. And one more detail, or one more installation shot, and now finally to the last body of work that I want to show tonight. And this series of images is called Plastic on Paper, and it's actually hanging right now at Conner Contemporary Art in Washington, D.C. So this is work that I completed about a month ago. So it's very recent. And it's very similar aesthetically and in some ways conceptually to a lot of my earlier work, but the subject matter is different. These are all plastic shopping bags. And there was one day when I just sort of looked in our pantry where we keep them, and it's like these things just grow and grow, and even if you try not to take things in plastic bags, you still end up with piles and piles of these things. And this image is and they're titled by the store, so this is Target. And then I've got a couple details of this particular bag. And so these are done just like the wafers that I did on the scanner, where I'm taking these bags, kind of crumpling them up, sandwich them in a flatbed scanner, and then scanning it as a transparency, so the light's going through it, and then also scanning it as reflective art, and then bringing those two files together. But it's predominantly that transparency scan that I'm using for the final images. And so these, like the wafers, I felt like kind of reference medical imagery. They seemed like they might be some type of organism that's being studied. It's isolated in this white space. They also reminded me a lot of X-rays. Not X-rays like what I was doing with the walls, or in the same way that the X-ray looked with the Bible pages, but I was thinking about X-rays at airports when you kind of put your bags down and then you see that image on the monitor. They reminded me of that, and maybe because these were bags, these were things that we used to carry merchandise in. There was a very direct kind of reference or critique on our culture of production and consumption and the waste that is created. And the gallery sent out a little press release, and I thought they summed up this series of work very well, and they said that Kessman presents a typology of contemporary life through the transformation of plastic shopping bags. And, for me as an artist in this series and in, all of the work that I've done, it's very much about the process of transforming an object, and sometimes that's a very sort of ordinary, everyday object, in order to reveal kind of other levels of meaning. And I hope that that is what this work and some of the earlier work has done. So, thank you very much.